The late autumn evening wrapped Millbrook in a gentle darkness as Sarah Johnson rubbed her tired eyes. The clock on the city hall wall showed 8:45 p.m., marking another long day at work. As the newly elected mayor of this small town, her days often stretched well beyond normal working hours. Sarah gathered her papers from the council meeting, carefully placing them in her leather briefcase. The meeting had run longer than expected, with heated debates about the town's new development project. Being the first African-American woman to serve as mayor in Millbrook's history, she felt an extra burden to excel in everything she did. "Good night, Mayor Johnson," called out Linda, the cleaning lady, as Sarah walked through the empty hallway. Sarah smiled warmly, remembering how her mother had also worked as a cleaner to put food on their table. "Good night, Linda. Don't work too hard," she replied, her voice carrying the warmth that had helped her win the election. The parking lot was nearly empty when Sarah reached her car, a modest 5-year-old Honda Civic. She had noticed the broken headlight 3 days ago when a teenage boy accidentally hit it with his baseball in the community park. Between budget meetings, community outreach programs, and countless other responsibilities, she hadn't found time to get it fixed. "I'll take care of it this weekend," Sarah muttered to herself, just as she had the past few days. She turned the key in the ignition, and the engine came to life with a soft purr. The streets of Millbrook were quiet at this hour. Small businesses had closed for the day, and only a few restaurants remained open, their warm lights creating patches of brightness along Main Street. Sarah drove carefully, well aware of her car's broken headlight. As she passed Thompson's grocery store, blue and red lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Sarah's heart sank a little, but she remained calm. She had been pulled over enough times in her life to know exactly what to do. Slowly, she pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Officer Mike Peters approached her car, flashlight beam dancing across her window. Sarah pressed the button to lower it, maintaining a composed expression. "License and registration, ma'am," Officer Peters said, his tone professional but cold. Sarah reached slowly for her purse, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. "Of course, officer," she replied, her voice steady. She handed over the requested documents. "Are you aware that you're driving with a broken headlight, ma'am?" Officer Peters asked, examining her license under his flashlight. "Yes, officer. It happened earlier this week. I've been meaning to get it fixed, but my schedule has been quite full," Sarah explained truthfully. The officer's flashlight beam moved across her face, then through the car's interior. "That's not a valid excuse, ma'am. Driving with broken lights is a serious safety violation." Sarah nodded, accepting the rebuke quietly. Despite her position as mayor, she didn't mention it. She believed in equal treatment under the law, even if it meant accepting a ticket. Officer Peters returned to his patrol car with her documents. Through her mirrors, Sarah could see him typing on his computer. After several minutes, he returned with a citation and her papers. "I'm issuing you a citation for driving with defective equipment," he said, handing her the ticket. "You'll need to appear in court next Thursday at 9 a.m. Make sure to get that headlight fixed immediately." "I understand, officer." "Thank you," Sarah replied, accepting the citation with dignity. As Officer Peters walked away, Sarah looked at the ticket in her hands. She could have easily mentioned her position as mayor, could have tried to get out of the ticket, but that wasn't who she was or what she stood for. Starting her car again, Sarah drove home carefully, her mind already planning how to fit a repair shop visit into her packed schedule. Little did she know that this simple traffic stop would soon lead to an incident that would shake up the entire town of Millbrook and force everyone to confront some uncomfortable truths about justice and prejudice in their community. Later that night, as Sarah sat in her modest home office reviewing the next day's meetings, she placed the citation carefully in her planner. She would handle this like any other citizen of Millbrook, with respect for the law and the proper procedures. After all, true leadership meant leading by example, even when no one was watching. 2 weeks passed quickly in the busy life of Mayor Sarah Johnson. Between managing the town's affairs and attending countless community meetings, she had managed to get her car's headlight fixed the day after receiving the ticket. The repair shop owner had offered to do it for free when he recognized her, but Sarah insisted on paying the full price like any other customer. On a Tuesday morning, while sorting through her mail at her desk in City Hall, Sarah found the official court summons. The envelope was plain and white, just like the one sent to every other citizen. She opened it carefully, reading the formal language that required her to appear in traffic court the following Thursday at 9 a.m. sharp. "Everything all right, Mayor Johnson?" asked Tom, her assistant, noticing her studying the letter with such attention. "Yes, Tom, just a court date for a traffic violation," Sarah replied honestly. She had nothing to hide. "Please clear my schedule for next Thursday morning, and Tom, let's keep this between us. I don't want any special treatment." Tom nodded, though he looked confused. "Ma'am, I could make a call to the court. I'm sure they would." "No," Sarah interrupted firmly but kindly. "That's exactly what I don't want. I'm going to handle this like any other citizen would have to." Later that evening, as Sarah prepared for her court appearance, she stood before her closet thinking carefully about what to wear. She chose a simple navy blue business suit, professional but not flashy. She deliberately left off her mayoral pin and any other symbols of her office. Her phone rang. It was her mother, Margaret, calling for their daily chat. "Baby, I heard about your court summons," Margaret said, concern in her voice. "Word travels fast in small towns." Sarah sighed, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Mom, it's just a traffic ticket. Nothing to worry about." "Child, you know as well as I do that it's never just a traffic ticket for people who look like us," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "You should wear your mayoral pin. Let them know who you are." "No, Mom," Sarah said firmly. "I want to be treated like everyone else. That's the whole point of fair justice, isn't it?" There was a pause on the line before Margaret spoke again. "You always were stubborn, just like your father. Just promise me you'll hold your head high in there." "Don't I always?" Sarah smiled, thinking of all the lessons her parents had taught her about dignity and self-respect. The next morning, Sarah reviewed the court documents one last time over breakfast. The summons listed Judge Richard Peterson as the presiding judge. She had heard about him, known for being strict with traffic violations and having what some called old-fashioned views. As she drove to the courthouse, Sarah noticed several people doing double takes as they recognized her walking up the courthouse steps. A young intern from the local newspaper even pulled out his phone, probably to take a picture, but Sarah just smiled and walked past with her usual grace. Inside the courthouse, Sarah took a seat in the back row of the courtroom, observing as other cases were called before hers. She watched Judge Peterson carefully, noting how he spoke to different defendants. She couldn't help but notice his tone seemed to change depending on who stood before him. A young white college student received a warning for running a stop sign. An elderly Asian man got a reduced fine for an expired registration. But when a young black man tried to explain why he couldn't afford to pay his speeding ticket right away, the judge showed little sympathy. Sarah took mental notes of everything, not as the mayor, but as a citizen concerned about justice. She knew that whatever happened in her case today could be important for more than just herself. As she waited for her name to be called, Sarah remained calm and composed. Years of facing prejudice and overcoming obstacles had taught her that dignity was often the most powerful response to injustice. She straightened her jacket and checked once more that her mayoral pin was safely tucked away in her purse. Little did Judge Peterson know that the next case on his docket would force him to confront his own biases in a way he never expected. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 3, casting long shadows across the wooden benches. Sarah Johnson sat quietly in the back row, watching Judge Richard Peterson handle the morning's traffic cases. The clock on the wall showed 9:45 a.m., and her case hadn't been called yet. Judge Peterson sat high on his bench, his gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him an appearance of authority. His black robe seemed to make him even more imposing as he looked down at each defendant. Sarah noticed how his fingers would often drum impatiently on his desk while people tried to explain their situations. Case number 247, the court clerk called out, "James Wilson, speeding violation." A young white man in a business suit walked to the front. His tie was slightly crooked, and his hands shook as he held his papers. "Mr. Wilson," Judge Peterson's voice was almost friendly, "I see this is your first offense. Care to explain why you were doing 45 in a 30 zone?" "Yes, Your Honor," James replied. "I was late for an important meeting, and I wasn't paying attention to my speed." The judge nodded understanding. "Well, we all make mistakes. I'll reduce the fine to $50, but don't let it happen again. Sarah watched as James left the courtroom with a relieved smile. She made mental notes of how different this treatment was from what she had seen earlier, when a Hispanic woman with the same violation received a full fine. The next case involved an elderly black woman who had parked in a no-parking zone. Despite her explanation about her arthritis and the long walk to the pharmacy, Judge Peterson showed no mercy. The law is the law, Mrs. Taylor. The fine stands at $100. The old woman's shoulders drooped as she slowly made her way out of the courtroom. Sarah felt her heart ache, remembering her own grandmother who had faced similar situations. As more cases were called, Sarah observed the patterns in Judge Peterson's behavior. His tone changed subtly, but noticeably depending on who stood before him. With some defendants, he was patient and understanding. With others, particularly minorities, his words became clipped and his sentences harsher. The court officer, a middle-aged man named Bill, kept glancing at Sarah with a puzzled expression. She could tell he recognized her but was confused about why the mayor would be sitting in traffic court like any other citizen. Case number 253, the clerk announced. Maria Rodriguez, expired registration. A young mother approached the bench, holding a sleeping baby. She tried to explain in broken English how she had been saving money for the registration, but had to use it for her child's medicine instead. Judge Peterson cut her off mid-sentence. Ms. Rodriguez, the law doesn't make exceptions for personal circumstances. The fine is $200. Sarah watched as tears welled up in Maria's eyes. Another woman in the courtroom quickly went to help her with the baby while she fumbled in her purse for money. The clock ticked on, and the morning grew warmer. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, barely keeping the room comfortable as more people filed in and out. Sarah noticed how some defendants left the courtroom angry, others relieved, and many looking defeated. A young court intern entered quietly and whispered something to the clerk. The clerk's eyes widened slightly as she looked at Sarah, then quickly looked away. Word was spreading about the mayor's presence in the courtroom. Judge Peterson remained oblivious to the whispers and glances. He continued handling cases with the same varying degrees of patience and strictness, clearly showing his biases in every interaction. Sarah's palms felt slightly damp as she realized her case would be coming up soon. She took a deep breath, remembering all the times she had faced prejudice in case number 256, the clerk announced, her voice slightly different than before. Sarah Johnson, defective equipment violation. The courtroom had grown warmer as the morning wore on. Judge Peterson barely looked up from his papers as Sarah walked confidently to stand before his bench. Her heels made soft clicking sounds on the wooden floor, echoing in the now unusually quiet courtroom. Ms. Johnson, Judge Peterson said, drawing out her name with a hint of impatience. You were cited for driving with a broken headlight. How do you plead? Sarah stood straight, her voice clear and steady. Guilty, Your Honor. This made the judge look up briefly, probably surprised by her direct admission. Most people tried to make excuses or plead not guilty. Well, at least you're honest about it, he said, his tone carrying a slight edge. Would you care to explain why you were driving with faulty equipment? Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. The headlight was damaged earlier that week. Due to my busy schedule, I wasn't able to get it fixed immediately. However, I did have it repaired the very next day after receiving the citation. Judge Peterson's pen tapped against his desk. Your busy schedule? He repeated, his voice taking on a mocking tone. Ms. Johnson, everyone has a busy schedule. That's not an excuse for endangering public safety. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The court clerk looked down at her desk, her face showing concern. I understand, Your Honor, Sarah responded, maintaining her composure. I take full responsibility for the violation. The judge leaned forward, his expression stern. Oh, you take responsibility, do you? How generous of you. His sarcasm was clear to everyone in the room. Tell me, Ms. Johnson, what is so important in your schedule that you couldn't find time to fix a simple headlight? Before Sarah could answer, he continued, Let me guess, hair appointment? Shopping? What could be so pressing? A few gasps could be heard from the gallery. The racial undertones in his words were impossible to miss. Sarah took a deep breath before speaking. Actually, Your Honor, I had back-to-back meetings regarding the city budget, a community development project, and several town council sessions. Judge Peterson waved his hand dismissively. Ms. Johnson, I've heard every excuse in the book. The law doesn't care about your meetings or whatever else you think is more important. The fact is, you knowingly drove an unsafe vehicle on our streets. He shuffled some papers on his desk, not bothering to look at her again. Given your apparent disregard for public safety and your less than convincing explanation, I'm imposing the maximum fine of $500. The courtroom fell into shocked silence. Everyone who had been there all morning knew this was far more than what others had received for similar or worse violations. Sarah stood perfectly still, her dignity intact. Yes, Your Honor, she said quietly. The court clerk, Mrs. Davis, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable, spoke up in a shaky voice. Your Honor, should I process Mayor Johnson's payment now or? Judge Peterson's head snapped up so fast his glasses slipped down his nose. What did you say? I asked about Mayor Johnson's payment, sir, Mrs. Davis repeated, her voice stronger now. The color drained from Judge Peterson's face as he finally really looked, at Sarah standing before him. Recognition dawned in his eyes as he realized he had just berated and fined the mayor of Millbrook. Sarah remained calm, meeting his startled gaze with steady eyes, the same eyes that had looked out from campaign posters all over town just months ago, the same eyes that now oversaw every town council meeting. The silence in the courtroom grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Peterson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. His earlier confidence had vanished completely. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice clear and professional. Will that be all, Your Honor? I have a town council meeting to attend at noon. The judge's face had turned an interesting shade of red. The power dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically, but Sarah maintained her dignified stance, waiting patiently for his response. Judge Peterson's courtroom had never been so quiet. The air conditioning's gentle hum seemed thunderous in the silence that followed the revelation of Sarah's identity. Every eye in the room darted between the judge's reddening face and the mayor's composed expression. Mayor Johnson, Judge Peterson finally managed to say, his voice having lost all its previous authority. I had no idea. That's quite all right, Your Honor. Sarah replied calmly. I didn't expect any special treatment today. That's why I didn't mention my position. A young reporter who had been dozing in the back row was now wide awake, furiously typing on his phone. Several other people had their phones out too, although court rules strictly prohibited their use. The court bailiff, unsure of what to do, stood awkwardly by his post. Even Mrs. Davis, the clerk who had inadvertently revealed Sarah's identity, sat frozen at her desk, papers clutched tightly in her hands. Judge Peterson cleared his throat. Perhaps we should reconsider the fine, he suggested, shuffling papers on his desk without actually looking at them. Given your position and responsibilities to the community. Sarah raised her hand slightly, stopping him mid-sentence. With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't believe my position should influence the fine. If $500 is the appropriate punishment for this... News of what happened in Judge Peterson's courtroom spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By lunchtime, local news websites had already posted their first stories. The young reporter who had witnessed everything, Jimmy Chen from the Millbrook Daily, wrote a detailed article that quickly became the most read story on their website. Sarah sat in her office at City Hall, reading through the flood of emails and messages that had started pouring in. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since she left the courthouse. Linda, her secretary, had already turned away dozens of reporters. Mayor Johnson, Linda called through the intercom. Channel 5 News is here. They're requesting an interview. Tell them I'll release a statement tomorrow, Sarah replied calmly, continuing to sort through her emails. Many were from citizens sharing their own experiences with unfair treatment in court. One email particularly caught her attention. It was from Maria Rodriguez, the young mother who had been fined $200 for her expired registration earlier that morning. She wrote about how watching Sarah stand up to the judge had given her hope. A knock on her office door interrupted her reading. Tom, her assistant, entered with a stack of papers. Ma'am, you might want to see these, he said, placing them on her desk. They're court records from the past 6 months. The patterns are interesting. Sarah looked at the documents. They showed clear differences in fines and sentences based on race and social status. What happened to her wasn't an isolated incident. Call Councilman Williams and Councilwoman Rivera, Sarah instructed Tom. We need to discuss this at tomorrow's meeting. As the afternoon progressed, more stories emerged. People began sharing their courthouse experiences on social media. Some had faced harsh fines like Sarah, while others talked about receiving lighter sentences for the same violations. Around 3 p.m., an unexpected visitor arrived at City Hall. Mrs. Davis, the court clerk who had revealed Sarah's identity, stood nervously in the reception area. Mayor Johnson will see you, Linda said, leading her to Sarah's office. Mrs. Davis twisted her hands together as she entered. Mayor Johnson, I hope I didn't overstep this morning. I just couldn't stay quiet anymore after seeing how the judge was treating you. Sarah smiled warmly. You did the right thing, Mrs. Davis. Sometimes justice needs a little help to work properly. I've worked in that courtroom for 20 years, Mrs. Davis continued, gaining confidence. I have records, notes about the different treatments, if you need them. That would be very helpful, Sarah replied, gesturing for her to sit down. Would you be willing to share your observations with our review committee? As they discussed the details, another visitor arrived, Robert Martinez, president of the local bar association. He had heard about the morning's events and wanted to offer his organization's support for any reform Sarah might propose. The legal community has been concerned about these issues for a while, he explained, but we needed someone to bring it into the open. Sarah looked out her office window at the town square below. People were gathered in small groups, clearly discussing the morning's events. She noticed how the conversations included people from all parts of the community, something rare in Millbrook. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Proud of you, baby. Your father would be too. As the day drew to a close, Sarah received one more surprising visitor. Judge Peterson's clerk brought over a letter. The judge had spent the afternoon reviewing every case from the past month and had already adjusted several fines to match standard guidelines. Sarah read his letter carefully. While it wasn't exactly an apology, it showed that the morning's events had affected him deeply. He requested a meeting to discuss how to make the court system fairer for everyone. Looking at the sunset through her office window, Sarah thought about how one simple traffic ticket had turned into something much bigger. Sometimes change needed a spark, and today's events might just be that spark Millbrook needed. She began drafting her statement for tomorrow's press conference, knowing that what she said next would be crucial in turning this incident into real, lasting change for their community. The next morning, Sarah arrived at City Hall earlier than usual. She had spent most of the night preparing for the town hall meeting she had called to address the courthouse incident. The large meeting room was already filling up by 8 a.m., an hour before the scheduled start. We've had to set up extra chairs in the hallway, Tom informed her, looking overwhelmed. And Channel 5 News has set up their cameras. The room's almost full. Sarah nodded, reviewing her notes one last time. She had deliberately invited Judge Peterson to attend, sending him a personal letter rather than a formal summons. To her surprise, his office had confirmed his attendance. People from all parts of Millbrook filled the seats. Business owners, teachers, factory workers, and students. Sarah noticed Maria Rodriguez sitting near the front, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. Mrs. Davis from the court had also come, clutching a thick folder of documents. At exactly 9 a.m., Sarah walked to the podium. The room fell silent. Good morning, she began, her voice clear and strong. Yesterday, something happened in our courthouse that has started an important conversation in our community. But this isn't about me or any single incident. This is about justice, fairness, and how we treat each other in Millbrook. Camera flashes went off as she continued speaking. I've received hundreds of messages from citizens sharing similar experiences. Some were fined more harshly than others for the same violations. Some felt they weren't given a chance to explain their situations. This isn't the justice system we want for our town. The crowd murmured in agreement. Sarah noticed Judge Peterson sitting in the back row, looking uncomfortable but attentive. But today, Sarah continued, we're not here to point fingers or assign blame. We're here to find solutions. I'm announcing the formation of a judicial review committee that will examine our court practices and recommend changes. She then outlined her plan. mandatory bias training for all court officials, regular reviews of sentencing patterns, and a new community feedback system for the courts. Each point was met with nods and approving whispers. To everyone's surprise, Judge Peterson stood up and walked to the podium when Sarah invited comments from the audience. The room grew tense. "Mayor Johnson," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "Yesterday opened my eyes to something I hadn't wanted to see. I spent the night reviewing my past decisions, and I realize now that I haven't always been as fair as a judge should be." The room was silent as he continued. "I want to be part of the solution. I'm volunteering to lead the first bias training session, sharing my own experience as a lesson for others." Sarah smiled warmly, extending her hand to the judge. As they shook hands, cameras flashed again, capturing the moment of reconciliation. More people stood up to share their stories. An elderly black man talked about his grandson's unfair treatment in court. A Hispanic business owner described her struggles with different standards of justice. Each story added to the picture of a system that needed change. Mrs. Davis stepped forward with her folder. "I have records," she announced. "Years of data showing the patterns of unequal treatment. I'm willing to help the review committee analyze them." Sarah watched as people who had never spoken to each other began discussing solutions. Robert Martinez from the Bar Association offered free legal clinics. Local business owners proposed a fund to help people pay for vehicle repairs so they could avoid violations in the first place. As the meeting continued, Sarah noticed something remarkable happening. People weren't just talking about court reform anymore. They were discussing broader changes in the community, how to make Millbrook more inclusive, more understanding, more united. "This is just the beginning," Sarah told the crowd as the meeting drew to a close. "Real change takes time and effort from everyone, but today has shown me that Millbrook is ready for that change." Looking around the room, Sarah saw hope in people's faces. Her mother's words from years ago echoed in her mind. Sometimes it takes a small moment to start a big change. Yesterday's traffic court incident had become that moment for Millbrook. 6 months had passed since that memorable day in Judge Peterson's courtroom. The autumn leaves were falling again in Millbrook as Sarah Johnson sat in her office, reviewing the Judicial Review Committee's first progress report. The numbers told a powerful story. Court fines were now consistently applied regardless of race or social status. The new community feedback system had collected over 1,000 responses, showing growing trust between citizens and the court system. "Mayor Johnson," Tom called from the doorway. "They're ready for the ceremony." Sarah gathered her papers and walked to the courthouse steps where a small crowd had gathered. It was a special day, the official opening of Millbrook's new Community Justice Center, a direct result of the changes sparked by that traffic court incident. Judge Peterson stood at the podium, looking different from the man he'd been 6 months ago. The bias training sessions, which he'd led himself, had changed not just him but many others in the legal system. 6 months ago, the judge began his speech. "I learned an important lesson about justice from our mayor. Today, we're making sure that lesson becomes a permanent part of our community." Sarah watched from her seat as he described the changes. The Community Justice Center would provide legal aid to those who couldn't afford it, offer mediation services, and house the new court monitoring program that ensured fair treatment for everyone. Maria Rodriguez, now employed as the center's community outreach coordinator, stood proudly with her baby, who wasn't so little anymore. She had become one of the strongest voices for change in the community. Mrs. Davis sat in the front row, smiling. Her careful record-keeping had provided the evidence needed to support the reforms. She now headed the court's new data analysis team, monitoring patterns in sentencing and fines. The local newspaper had played its part too. Jimmy Chen, the young reporter who'd witnessed the original incident, had written a series of articles exposing other instances of unfair treatment. His work had won a regional journalism award. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she looked out at the diverse crowd. There were faces from every part of Millbrook, people who might never have come together if not for that day in traffic court. "Change doesn't happen by accident," she began. "It happens when people are brave enough to stand up for what's right, honest enough to admit their mistakes, and willing to work together for something better." She shared stories of what had been accomplished, the new court translation services, the vehicle repair assistance program that had helped dozens of residents fix safety issues before they became violations, and the regular town halls where citizens could voice their concerns directly to court officials. Robert Martinez from the Bar Association reported that complaints about unfair treatment had dropped by 70%. The free legal clinics were helping people understand their rights and responsibilities better. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared refreshments, Sarah overheard conversations that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Judge Peterson was chatting with community members who'd once feared entering his courtroom. Police officers were discussing community engagement strategies with former critics. Her mother, who had come for the ceremony, hugged her tightly. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. "You didn't just win a battle that day, you started a revolution of kindness." Later that evening, as Sarah walked through the town square, she stopped to read the new plaque outside the Community Justice Center. It bore a simple message: "Justice sees no differences, only equals." A young girl walking with her mother pointed at Sarah. "Mom, isn't that the mayor from the story? The one who changed things?" Sarah smiled and waved, remembering how one small incident had sparked such big changes. The traffic ticket that could have been just another example of unfair treatment had instead become a catalyst for transformation. As she drove home, both headlights working perfectly, Sarah thought about how sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of courage. Millbrook wasn't perfect yet, but it was becoming what she had always believed it could be, a place where justice truly meant justice for all.